Arthur Burney was not inside the club like Mr. Bankowitz said. He was outside the club where he saw the shooting. What we say is not evidence, and I hope you keep that in mind. A lot of the things that Mr. Bankowitz said simply were not evidence in this case, or something that you can infer from the evidence. Mr. Burney was not inside the club. We're not playing a game of telephone here either. Okay? We have trials so that witnesses can come into court without a middleman and speak directly to you all, so that you all can listen to them and judge the credibility of their testimony. That is why we have trials. This is not a game of telephone. Your job as a jury is to listen to evidence and make inferences. Mr. Gorley said that you have to make your decision based on what you hear from the witness stand. And that's right. But you as a jury are allowed to make inferences from the evidence. We talked about in jury selection circumstantial evidence, things which point to a fact being true. You get to decide if that fact is true. You don't see Michael Smith run around the side of the building in Melissa Hall's cell phone video. You just don't. What you see is Javon Collins go up to him with I love beer, appear to do something with their hands, and then run off in that direction. Like 40 seconds later, you see Mr. Smith hop out and emerge from the side of the building. Now, you don't see him go around the side of the building, but you can infer from the fact that he ran in that direction and then walked out, and he went around the side of the building. You don't see Gary King's Kia with his and Joshua Rainey's ID in it leave the scene within minutes of the shooting. But you've heard enough other facts that should convince you that that is where the Kia was. Kuner Oates getting the tag number, Kiera Scott seeing the vehicle parked there when they left the club, and there being no vehicle there when the deputies got there, the police officers got there minutes later. So you're not going to always have every fact told to you directly from a witness's mouth. There are other facts from which you have to make inferences. That is your job as a jury. Now, Mr. Gorley, he seems to want you to ignore the videos. He wants you to ignore what he referred to somewhat denigratingly as a fancy timeline. The timeline is not fancy. It's actually pretty plain. It's pretty straightforward. When you take a look at the timeline constructed from the videos, what you get is this. Okay? What you get is that the shooting stops 2.5 minutes after Melissa Hall's video ends. There's nothing fancy about this timeline. In fact, the font is bigger in the right-hand column than the other two columns. It's not fancy. What it is, though, is showing you how you can take the evidence and learn and infer other facts and know them to be true based on that evidence. You have, and I think Mr. Gorley referred to her as the blob, the woman wearing a white dress. You see her by the door camera after Michael Smith walks away. You see it on both videos, same event. You then see the man in the hat and the collared shirt leaving. And Mr. Beckwith says, well, green can't be a bright color. Perhaps Mr. Bankowitz wasn't watching this video. Perhaps he wasn't maybe looking at this photograph here of that man in a green shirt, which looks bright. Green can be a bright color. That is the brightest, that's brighter than red in that picture. So the timeline is not fancy. The timeline is factual. And it's a fact by which you can then measure the credibility of other witnesses. Witnesses like Kiera Scott and Javon Collins, witnesses whose entire testimony is based on an assumption that is false. Okay, their testimony is based on, they say, we did not see Laquan shooting, and he was going, hands up, right? He was another gun. Who's shooting? They know that he was doing that because they had just let go. But they didn't just, Kiera didn't just let go of Laquan less than 10 seconds before that. Kiera lets go of Laquan after that. This is the end of Melissa Hall's cell phone video.
Let me go, bud. Hold on, let me go. Let me out. And I'm all in my car.
Seconds from the end of that video, they've let go and they're now marching up the road. Okay? This is not, these men can't say that Laquan Barrow wasn't shooting a gun. They want you to believe that they can say that. Because he's a friend of theirs. But they can't say that. Not with any degree of credibility or truthfulness. So, the timeline's not fancy. The timeline's the fact. And Mr. Gorley said he can follow the video. Just because he can't doesn't mean you can't. Rely upon, you can rely upon not only the testimony of the witnesses, but all the evidence. The body cameras, the cell phone video, the door video, the timeline, whatever else you deem to be true based on the evidence.
The timeline is not evidence.
Rely on your conclusions about the timeline. There was some argument about how to weigh witnesses' testimony. You all should be consistent in how you weigh witnesses' testimony. It was suggested that people are saying this because they're friends with the Robinson family. I think Mr. Bankowitz said that Jarrell Shaw is saying this because he's friends with the Kendricks. Again, not fact, not testified to. He learned after this that he is somehow related to Benitria through like the marriage of a cousin. Okay? It's a small town. He's moved up here. He's going to meet people here, get married. Family might know people through cousins. He does not know the Kendricks. We talked about the principles in the independent act instruction. And the decision you all make about Mr. Barrow, Mr. Smith, and King, they all do affect each other in this case. They are principles in this crime. If you believe they were and that they were acting in concert, the actions of the other, they all share in the legal sense. In the eyes of the law, they are a single person and they're each responsible for what the other ones did. This is not some independent act where they decided to go shoplifting at Walmart and on the way out of the door somebody puts a bullet in the clerk's head. It's not that. These men were talking about shooting. They were discussing getting guns. Mr. Barrow said he needed his stick. They went and they got the guns and they fired. Within 4.5 seconds, they fired off 21 rounds. I think Ms. Hawthorne said that there was no conspiracy or statement. There's no plan divulged to you. So that we have to then assume, well, because each of them separately pulled the trigger with their own finger, they are all independent of one another. But that's like saying that 3 people who get in a car and go and are driving by a house, as they drive by the house, they all start shooting the house up together. As they're passing, they fire 21 rounds into the house, are somehow not joined in the legal sense. Because they each fired the trigger separately, and because there's no evidence that they had a specific plan in mind, you can infer a plan and infer their co-participation in this crime from the evidence. These 3 people did not independently fire into that crowd of people. Detective Rodriguez's body camera will make that clear for you. Ms. Hawthorne talked a little bit about reasonable doubt in the context of the shell casings and projectiles and matching those up. Evidence that doesn't prove, when the evidence doesn't prove something that is not an element of the crime, that is not reasonable doubt. Laura Draga didn't tell you that the projectiles, Ms. Hawthorne said she didn't tell you the projectiles matched the casing in any way. It's not quite accurate. What Ms. Draga said was that the projectiles and the jacketing in the corner of the building and the projectiles of Ms. Robinson are from the same firearm. She told you the projectiles are consistent based on her experience with having been manufactured by Federal. She told you that 13 of the casings, the ones at easels 1 through 5, were also manufactured by Federal. But she told you that sometimes Federal can manufacture a projectile that another cartridge maker will then load into their cartridge. And she said it doesn't make sense from a business perspective, but hey, that's what they did. So, that has nothing to do with the questions that are going to be posed to you on the verdict forms, which really is the entire focus of your deliberations. Now, if Mr. Smith were charged with second-degree murder of Benitria Robinson, and in addition to being asked whether or not he possessed and discharged the firearm, there was the additional interrogatory that as a result of the discharge, he caused death or great bodily harm to Ms. Robinson, that would be reasonable doubt. Because there is a reasonable explanation for how maybe the projectile in Benitria wasn't fired by the Federal casings. See? So did Mr. Smith actually fire the fatal shot? There's some question of that because of what Ms. Draga told you, that sometimes Federal can sell their projectiles to other people. But that is not a question before you. You all simply have to decide whether or not he participated in a shooting, the result of which ended Ms. Robinson's life. And mere inconsistency in some way, shape, or form is not reasonable doubt. Mr. Smith, you've heard he was wearing black in the club. We know Laquan Barrow was wearing a black t-shirt in the club. We knew when Laquan Barrow was outside, his black t-shirt was gone. He was now wearing a tank top. We know that Mr. Barrow had his black t-shirt back on the following day. So we know sometime between him leaving the club and him being interviewed by the police, he found some way to reunite himself with his shirt. Michael Smith could also have had a very similar opportunity to change his clothing, to put something different on. And what people are wearing at any moment in time can change. People can change their clothing. There was a statement that people were paying hundreds of dollars to get in the club that night. No one paid hundreds to get in. Somebody paid some amount of money to park in the VIP spot, but nobody was paying hundreds of dollars to get in. And there was some mention about Herbert Welcome. Well, he was wearing a black polo shirt. That's not true. It's not. Mr. Welcome, you can see him, and I think he was wearing a polo shirt and he got into a black car. So he must be the person Jarrell Shaw saw. But if you go ahead and take a look here, you see this car over here? That's going to be the car Mr. Welcome gets into. Right, there it is. And if you look, you're going to see it's going to be a champagne, probably colored Honda Accord. There it is again. There it is leaving. And there's Mr. Welcome getting in. Now what do you see? You see a polo shirt? No. What you see over here is the black of his shirt and the skin of his arm, same color as the skin of his face, because he's wearing a black tank top, not a polo shirt. Okay? And Mr. Welcome was here. You got to see him. Him and Michael Smith look nothing alike. Mr. Welcome's not a thin man. Mr. Welcome's got some weight on him. Said he weighed 220 pounds. Okay? 6 foot, 220. Mr. Welcome is a big boy. He's a solid guy. He does not look like Michael Smith. He's got short hair. Mr. Smith, you got to see the photo lineups that depict how his hair would have looked around that time. Mr. Smith has a short fro. There's no mistaking them from one another. Now this side camera business, there was some discussion about whether or not the side camera could have captured the video, captured a recording of what happened. And that why wasn't there any forensic testing of the camera and the system? Why didn't we look into why didn't it record? The camera hasn't worked for years. Hasn't worked for years. It's never recorded, as long as Adam Dawkins has done their security. That is like going on a wild goose chase. Melissa Hall's video. Well, why wasn't there any forensic evaluation of the video? Questioning why it stopped when it did. Melissa Hall stopped the video because the fight out front appeared to be over. They were walking away. Things were quieting down. You can see that when you watch the video. Because Michael Smith went up and he convinced Laquan Barrow to walk away by saying, he's straight, he's straight, he's straight, let him go. They asked about forensic evaluation of the video to see. There are no parts of that video that are deleted. It runs continuously from point A to point B. You heard Detective Dada testify. Was there any testimony that there was even such a forensic evaluation available? Mr. Bankowitz said that Melissa Hall knows Gary King. She doesn't know Gary King. Laquan's actions on the video. Mr. Gorley said, wanting to fight doesn't equate to murder. Being angry doesn't equal murder. Saying F the police and those other things doesn't equate to murder. But what is that other thing that Mr. Gorley dared not utter during his closing argument? What is the one statement of his client that he dared not repeat? I'm going to shoot the shit out of him. Gonna need a casket for tonight. Those are powerful evidence that Mr. Barrow did exactly what he set out to do. And of course you can see Kiera Scott in the video. When every witness is asked about the man in the white shirt, when you finally see the video, you're going to notice Kiera Scott. When your attention is drawn to it. That's like telling somebody, don't think of an elephant. What image pops in your mind? An elephant. Okay? And we talk about kind of judging witnesses by the same standards. We're supposed to think, well, all these other people are just completely out of it because they don't see Kiera Scott. But we're not allowed to think Kiera Scott could be completely out of it if we're not seeing Michael Smith. Okay? People are going to notice different things at different times. I think what that shows you is that different people will, in fact, see and remember different things. People will pay attention to different things. We know Michael Smith was right there, up on Kiera Scott, up on Laquan Barrow. Okay? Just like we know Kiera Scott was also right there on top of Laquan Barrow. Even though everybody doesn't remember seeing them, they were there. Mr. Gorley tells you that, well, Jarrell Shaw, and he refers to Jarrell Shaw as like the state's best witness. I don't know who decided that he was the best witness. He's a witness, and he is a witness with a unique vantage point relative to the other witnesses. He may see a little bit more than the other witnesses, but there is no best witness. The witnesses are as they are, and they tell you what they tell you. But Jarrell Shaw said he did see Kiera Scott holding back Mr. Barrow, but he was also around the club for a little bit. It doesn't mean that that was what was happening right before the shooting, right? And Mr. Shaw, he could have seen Mr. Barrow from where he was, but what was he paying attention to? You know, this is the situation's developing. Mr. Shaw doesn't know how the story is going to end. What he sees is he's walking between a car. Is somebody say, "Bro, you better move," directly to him, which he takes a little affront at, like, and then he looks and sees, like, oh man, he looks down and sees that guy's holding a gun. Okay, that's the image he's going to remember. Gun, hand, down by the legs, orange shorts. And then he looks at him. And what he sees then is his face. The face that he said he's never going to forget as long as he lives. The face with a 1,000-yard stare, staring ahead at the target, at Mr. Kendrick with a target in mind. Javon Collins, again, says that he is with Mr. Barrow when the shooting starts, out by the white truck, but that simply doesn't match up to everything else. Mr. Collins, and Mr. Collins' entire timeline doesn't match up to everything else. Remember he said that him and Michael Smith walked out of the club and then they parted ways? They simply got out front. Mr. Smith, he doesn't know where he went, but he went down to the car. And Mr. Smith's little argument did not happen before he went into the club. Mr. Smith's argument happened after he left. You can tell that by the video. When you leave, you don't go back in. Everyone's getting kicked out. This is going to be about five and a half minutes before the shooting. Here comes Michael. Now watch him try to get back in. You can see here where it's paused, but the top counter keeps going. You see that? See that? That's how you know the bottom counter is the important one. There he is. You got to pull him back because he's getting aggressive. You have to have the woman in the white dress walks by. And what you know from that is that Michael Smith is outside then around Laquan Barrow until they all walk up the road together. Except for the time that he disappears around the side of the building. So Mr. Collins' timeline in terms of what his interaction with Michael Smith doesn't match the facts. Because if him and Michael Smith came out together, and that was the last time they interacted, then they didn't have the interaction that you observed between him, Mr. Smith, and I like beer. Mr. Shaw has, I think Mr. Banquet said Mr. Shaw was given a chance to view photographs before he identified Gary King, but that's not true. Mr. Shaw saw the shooting, talked to the police, went immediately to the sheriff's office. Mr. Shaw went to the sheriff's office and completed this photographic lineup. It's 5:09 in the morning. 3.5 hours after we had seen Gary King. There he is. He identifies him. 3.5 hours later. He's not shown any photographs in the meantime. He's shown these. Mr. Banquet said he had a chance to look at photographs. It's not true. Now, he did have a chance to look at photographs before we saw Michael Smith's picture and identified him. And whether that gets any weight is going to be up to you all to consider. But consider how he talked about it. He had went to a vigil that was held at the nightclub. While there, people were showing him Facebook photos because they knew he was there. He said he looked at several photos and then, he recognized somebody. Sometime later, the detectives come to him with a series of photographs. He again picks the same person. That night, just because he is inconsistent about what Mr. Smith was wearing, doesn't mean he didn't get a good look at his face. Doesn't mean he didn't get a good look at his shorts. He said he looked down and saw the gun. I will never forget that face again as long as I live. He watched him shoot, watched him empty out his entire gun. He didn't say he was wearing blue, greens, and pinks like Mr. Bankowitz told you. He said he saw Gary and Laquan getting something from a car. And you know, Mr. Gorley hangs his hat a lot on, well, Mr. Shaw doesn't say that night that he saw my client shooting. Okay? Mr. Shaw was in here. He had a chance to explain that to you. That it took time for memories to settle. That he's sure now that he saw what he saw. But Mr. Gorley says, well, isn't the best evidence of what happened the day after? Well, if we're going to apply that rule inflexibly, what about Dontarius Bartley? Does saying Mr. Shaw was right because it was made the day after mean that Mr. Bartley was right? I don't think they're going to like that argument because it cuts against them. So they only want that reasoning to work when it's going to benefit their client. Jarrell Shaw said he saw the shooters. He told the officer they left in a black car. Now, when he testified in court and he was asked about that statement, he said he saw them near the black car and that everybody else was saying that was them, that was them, that was them, which is why he told that to the police. This is why we have depositions. This is why we have trials, to flesh out this information fully. Because people, you got to think, what is going on when Mr. Shaw sees the police? He's just seen a murder. He's just seen a murder. He wants to give the police whatever information they have, or whatever information he could possibly give them. So he is going to give them whatever information he can give them. We have trials so that you can hear these people question and hear in depth why they said the things that they said, why they believe the things that they believed. Dee Dee Webster. She saw Laquan Barrow's picture on Facebook too, recognized him as going by the Facebook name of Quan Sosa. And if she could accurately identify him, why not Jarrell Shaw identify Michael Smith accurately after seeing him on Facebook? And we know Dee Dee Webster accurately identifies Laquan Barrow as the shooter because all of the evidence points to Laquan Barrow as the shooter. She describes them being near the dark truck, might have been getting something from the truck. Mr. Gorley says, well, Kiera Scott, he was threatened, right? Okay. He was simply told by police, you need to be honest with us today. Okay. They had no reason to believe Kiera Scott's done anything wrong. Be honest with us, because if you're not, it could be a lot of trouble for you. Mr. Gorley says, well, Mr. Scott he has not been inconsistent. Well, that's for you to decide, but there's a lot of things Mr. Scott either doesn't remember or remembers differently now than he remembered a week and a half ago, than he remembered 2 years ago. And somebody can be untruthful twice. The defense said there's no evidence they said that Melissa Hall did mention somebody in a free beer shirt handing off a gun when she was initially interviewed. That fact is not in evidence. What is in evidence is that she did not say the person then was Michael Eugene Smith. When she saw him in court, she believed it was him who was handing that off. And you would see how, given that they're both right by each other, they're right there in close proximity. They then go to the side of the building. They then come back and go up to Laquan Barrow. How she could, when she sees him, get the two of them confused and think that Michael Smith handed off. And maybe she did see him hand off a gun. But by the time they got back up there, she had confused what shirts they were wearing. But there's no evidence that she didn't tell the police about that the next morning. The defense said there was inconsistencies about Wayne Counsel and the practices of Cloud9 in hiring security, armed security. He told you they hire people from Tampa and Orlando. Mr. Pastorino said Orlando or Gainesville when they have armed security. They said Mr. Counsel, they could carry, but they have to get management permission, and that if any of them were, they have to notify management. This bouncer firing a warning shot, the only place that comes from is Dontarius Bartley, as he's saying, well, maybe it was Laquan, maybe it was a bouncer. I don't know. I really didn't see anything. I'm just going to tell you all what you want to hear. Okay? So that's the only place that comes from, that anybody even fired a warning shot. And the video of the shooting doesn't bear out that there was any warning shot fired. Ebony Yeomans. There's no, Mr. Bankovic said, well, she was influenced by other people. What evidence is there of that other than him insinuating it? There's absolutely no evidence of that. She identifies him in a photographic lineup about 2 days later, having seen him that night. Danielle is still in the hospital. Nathaniel's in a coma. She identifies him that night because she saw him shooting. And Mr. Bankovic said, well, she said Gary didn't shoot. That's not what she said. She said she didn't see Gary shooting. Okay? There's a big difference between those two in this context. Not seeing somebody shoot means they may have shot, you just didn't see it. If you say they affirmatively did not shoot, you're saying that you were watching them and that they were not firing a gun. The only people who say that about anybody in this case who's on trial here is going to be their friends. Their friends are the ones who come in and say that they were all hands up or ducking, not Ms. Yeomans. And then with Nate Kendrick, are we really going to devolve into name calling? Wild bull, raging bull? Yeah. Is that what this is going to be about? Who's got the worst nickname? Okay. He told you the story. It's a funny story involving Judge Futch and how he wore his glasses and him making a little hand sign at the club. And what did Nate tell you about that nickname? He wants to do positive things with his life. He doesn't want people calling him that anymore. He doesn't let people call him that anymore. He's not Munch. He laughed about that and said, that's my cousin. He was questioned about whether there was inconsistency about Mr. Barrow putting a gun in Danielle's face. He explained what he meant by that statement. Again, why we have trials. So that someone can say, it doesn't have to be like that to be a gun in the face. It could be like that to be a gun in the face. They're saying, well, he didn't identify Gary King. He was not shown a photographic lineup with Gary King. He's not contradicted by Jarrell Shaw. Both of him and Jarrell Shaw see Mr. Barrow, Mr. King, and Mr. Smith shooting that night. And while he does not tell Detective Newbanks Gary King was one of the shooters, he did not answer that question either. You heard Detective Newbanks recounting the interview, Detective Scala, talking about how when they asked him that question, they immediately then asked about, did you see anybody else? Wait, what kind of gun was it? Okay, people do that when they're asking questions. The lawyers have probably done that during court, where you begin asking one question, then segue right into another without getting the first one answered. It happens. And when they stopped the interview, it was because Nathaniel Kendrick appeared that he was done. And they were going to stop, and they said they would come back when he was maybe feeling a little better. Okay? Now, Nathaniel Kendrick, you heard, he didn't want to cooperate with this case, with this prosecution. He told you he abided by the code. Don't snitch. It's like the code of silence. You hear about omerta in conjunction with organized crime, mafia. Nate Kendrick has the code too, and it's not to snitch. So if Nate doesn't make a subsequent identification of them until he's deposed, has nothing to do with whether or not he actually saw them shooting. He was in a position to see them shooting. He had the best view from the front. Jarrell Shaw would have had a better view from the back. Both of them would have had unobstructed lines of sight at the people shooting. And if Danielle Kendrick's testimony differed, it was about whether or not she had gotten in a fight in the club or pepper sprayed or did anything that could be considered her committing a crime, like a disorderly conduct or something like that. But she identified Laquan Barrow as having shot her. And if you don't believe that Laquan Barrow's bullet is actually the one that's lodged near that young lady's spine, then if you convict Laquan Barrow of attempted second-degree murder, you just don't find that as a result of the discharge, death or you don't find that great bodily harm resulted. You find him guilty of attempted second-degree murder with possession of a firearm and discharge. There was mention that Daniela was a convicted felon. She wasn't. She's never been convicted of a felony or a crime involving dishonesty. She too doesn't say that Gary King wasn't the shooter. She did not see him shooting. But when you consider where Mr. King was relative to her, relative to Laquan Barrow, the man who's trying to fight with her and her brother, Mr. King's going to be up further toward 441. If she doesn't see him, there's a very good reason for that. Gunshot residue. Mr. Gourley talked about contamination. His questions during the trial were, what if it got inside, somehow like wandered itself inside of the bag? It got like inside of the stamp, and the analyst had to explain, no, like they're covered in like plastic, that really can't happen. Now, if it can fall off and be transferred, you would expect that to apply to door handles as well as hands. Okay, if gravity is going to make it fall, it's going to make it fall no matter what the surface is. Mr. Gourley says, well, Laquan Barrow, he went to the sheriff's office. He was cooperative. Is he cooperative because he's innocent or because he wants to appear that way? Was he calm or was he cold? And he wasn't wearing the same clothes as when this happened. He was wearing a tank top when this happened. Why don't they do it outside? They're dealing with somebody who's a suspect in a murder. Well, they don't know how many people. They know one's dead. They don't know what's going to happen with the rest. Nathaniel Kendrick was touch and go for a while. Danielle had a bullet by her spine. So why wouldn't they do it in a police station, in a controlled environment, where it could be monitored, videoed, where it's secure? And Detective Sergeant Miller said that Mr. Barrow never touched the door, that he touched all the doors. Now, I'll submit to you that
Overruled.
Sergeant Miller said he opened all the doors with his key card, and he would have been the one that was opening the doors up. End of the day, we're not asking you to rely upon the gunshot residue as proof that Laquan Barrow fired a gun. Okay? It's evidence he fired a gun, but it's not conclusive proof. It's proof simply that he had gunshot residue on his hands, which is consistent with him firing a gun, just like 9 other people who were there that night said he did. As far as Kuhner Oates, again, one of those, Mr. Banquet says, well, she said Gary King wasn't shooting. Again, not so. She didn't see Gary King shooting. Doesn't mean he wasn't shooting, just that she didn't see it. Just like Kiera Scott didn't see Michael Smith. He was there. He didn't see him. And what we know that she gets the tag number for that Kia. And what we know is that Kia winds up later back at Laquan Barrow's grandmother's house with a few people. Maisha Barrow, who's in the fight, Shigarian Hamilton, Laquan's girlfriend, you see walking away from Benitria's body, Kiera Scott, Javon Collins, and these 3 men. Javon Collins told you how they all turn up there together at 9324 Spring Terrace. Lateria Blocker, she's the one who sees them driving out of the back and give each other fist bump or high five, Mr. King and Mr. Barrow. Mr. Banquet says, well, how can Gary King be in the truck if his ID's in the car? Simple. He goes to the car, he unloads what he's got, he picks up something else like a gun, gets out, shoots, somebody else gets his car out of there quickly for him because he knows the car can be traced back to him. And they get into a rental truck together that's going to come back to Hertz or Avis or who knows where and leave. And she knows Laquan Barrow, she knows Gary King, and she saw them fist bump with each other. And congratulations on a job well done. We got him. And she saw Joshua Rainey, China White. I think Mr. Gourley insinuated China White was the other shooter. There's no evidence China White was shooting. China White's essentially a white man with long dreadlocks. There's no testimony at all from anybody. And any white-looking people with dreadlocks were out there shooting. But he stands out back there, and he would have stood out had he been shooting. He essentially is kind of almost the lone white person in a crowd of people who are largely African American. And what you see China White doing is wiping down a gun that Gary King, Laquan Barrow, or Michael Smith could have given to him. You heard from Mr. Collins that Mr. Rainey lives in the same area as them, is part of kind of their little group of people. and knows that they associate and are affiliated with one another. And Arthur Burney. What can you really say about Arthur Burney? That he's slow giving answers? That he's careful in what he says, in his descriptions? Mr. Burney identifies Laquan Barrow. He has no connection to anybody else. The only connection he has is he knows these people just from growing up here, and he's had Quan's sister over his house twice. You know, people are being loud is not evidence, or being loud is not murder, it's not. But saying you're going to shoot the shit out of somebody is evidence of murder. Mr. Bankowitz said, why would Gary King shoot somebody? He was being a peacemaker. Because Quan wanted him to. Because that's what they do. They're going to stand up for one another, and they're going to participate in one another. The feud of one is the feud of another. Nobody had a bone to pick with Nate before that night. Maybe Quan, because of the fight inside once the night gets going. He's pretty upset. You can see that. Michael Smith gets pretty upset. But there's no third person who has any reason to shoot at Nate Kendrick, but there was a third person. So the third person doesn't need a motive. A motive does not need to be proved. It's not an element of the crime. But for Gary King, the fact that Laquan, Michael were going to shoot at somebody, it's all the motivation he needed. You know, I think Nate Kendrick said it best, that there was no need for guns to get involved in this. What happened didn't warrant guns being involved. Another witness said if they had some problem with Nate, they should have taken care of it somewhere else. Not in front of the club. Not where somebody like Benitria, who had nothing to do with anything, was there. Mr. Gorley told you that the most important decision of his client's life is in your hands. On September 13th, 2015, the most important decision of Benitria Robinson's life was in the hands of these three men. They made that decision about what was going to happen to her. Not even a millionth of the thought that you've given to what's going to happen to them. There's a lot of evidence in this case. Hold these men accountable for the life that they took and the lives that they almost took. Convict them of what they did. Convict them of murdering that young lady. And convict them of shooting the other people who were there. Please.